Sitting is killing you. You have heard this. Everybody has heard this. Sitting is the new smoking, they say. You sit at your desk all day, and it is slowly, quietly murdering you from the inside. And so what did we do? We panicked. We bought standing desks, millions of them. We got rid of our chairs like they were poison, and we stood up, noble and tall, and we said, "There, I fixed it." Except you did not fix it. You did not fix anything. And I can prove it. See, I want to talk about something today that seems so obvious you would think there was nothing left to discuss. Sitting bad, standing good. That is the whole story, right? We have heard it so many times it sounds like a law of nature. But the thing about laws of nature is you had better check them. You had better look at what is actually happening inside the body, because the body does not read newspaper headlines. The body follows physics, and the physics of this problem is much stranger than anyone told you. Let me start by agreeing with the popular story. Let me make the strongest case I can for it, because that is the fair thing to do, and the people who raised the alarm were not fools. There was a very large study, almost 90,000 people tracked for 8 years, all wearing accelerometers on their wrists, so the researchers could actually measure how much they moved instead of just asking them, which, by the way, is important because people are terrible at estimating how much they sit. Terrible. You ask someone, "How much did you sit today?" and they say, "Oh, maybe 5 or 6 hours. The accelerometer says 9.5. Every time. We lie to ourselves about this more than almost anything else. So they measured it properly, and what they found was straightforward. People who sat for more than about 10.5 hours per day had significantly higher rates of heart failure and cardiovascular death. That is real. That is not a scare story. About 6% of all deaths worldwide can be attributed to excessive sitting time. In another study, almost 500,000 people, followed for 13 years, those who mostly sat at work had a 16% higher risk of dying from any cause and a 34% higher risk of dying from cardiovascular disease compared to people who were not sitting most of the day. And here is the part that really caught my attention. When I think this, even in the group of people who met the recommended guidelines for exercise, 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week, the risk of heart failure and cardiovascular death from prolonged sedentary behavior persisted. The exercise helped. It reduced the risk somewhat, but it did not erase it. You could go to the gym every morning, hit it hard for 45 minutes, and the 9 hours of sitting at your desk afterward would still be doing measurable damage. The sitting and the exercise were operating on separate tracks. So far, so terrifying. The message writes itself. Get out of the chair. Stand up. By the desk with the crank that goes up and down. Problem solved. But hold on, let me ask you a question that nobody seemed to ask during this whole panic. What actually happens inside your body when you sit? Not the hand waving, not the scary statistics, the actual physical molecular chain of events. Because if you want to fix a problem, you had better understand what the problem actually is. Otherwise, you are just guessing. Here's what happens. You sit down. Your large muscles, particularly in your legs and your back, go mostly quiet. They are not contracting. They are just hanging there, warm and slack, not doing much of anything. And inside those muscles, something very specific starts to change. There is an enzyme. It is called Lipoprotein lipase. I know, terrible name, but remember it because it turns out to be the main character of this whole story, and nobody talks about it. Lipoprotein lipase sits on the walls of your tiny blood vessels, your capillaries, inside the muscle tissue. Its job is to grab triglycerides, the fat particles floating through your blood, and break them apart. It cracks them open so the muscle can use them for fuel. It is like a little gatekeeper that pulls fat out of your bloodstream and hands it over to the cells that need it. When your muscles are active, even gently, even just bearing your weight and doing the small contractions involved in walking around a room, lipoprotein lipase is busy. It is working. The fat is getting cleared out of your blood at a reasonable rate. When you sit down and your muscles go quiet, lipoprotein lipase drops. And it does not drop a little bit. In studies on rats and later confirmed in human tissue, the activity of this enzyme falls by roughly 90 to 95% within hours of inactivity. 95%, almost all of it, gone, just from sitting still. Let me make sure you understand how shocking that is. We are not talking about a slow decline over weeks or months. We are talking about a few hours. You sit down after lunch, you do not get up, and by the time the afternoon is over, the enzyme responsible for pulling fat out of your blood has essentially shut off. It is as if someone turned off a pump in a drainage system. The water does not just slow down, it backs up. And it keeps backing up until you turn the pump on again. The researchers who discovered this, Mark Hamilton and his colleagues at the University of Missouri, found something else that was even more striking. The drop in lipoprotein lipase activity was not dependent on overall fitness level. You could be a person who runs 5 miles every morning, a dedicated athlete, and if you then sat for 8 hours at a desk without moving, your lipoprotein lipase crashed just like everyone else's. The morning run did not protect you from the afternoon of sitting. Exercise and inactivity operate through different physiological pathways. They are not opposite ends of the same dial. They are two separate dials entirely. Now think about what that means. The fat in your blood is not getting cleared. It starts to accumulate. Your triglyceride levels creep up. And because the system is connected, because everything in the body is always connected, your ability to process glucose also starts to decline. Your insulin sensitivity drops, your blood sugar handling gets worse, your blood vessels begin to experience the early stages of the kind of damage that, over years, leads to heart disease. This is the real mechanism. This is not a vague sitting is bad for you story. This is a specific molecular chain of events that we can actually observe and measure. And once you understand it, something very uncomfortable becomes obvious. The problem is not that you are sitting. The problem is that your muscles are not contracting. Do you see the difference? Because it seems like the same thing, but it is not. But it is not the same thing at all. A person sitting in a chair and a person standing perfectly still at a standing desk have something very important in common. In both cases, the large muscles are mostly inactive. Yes, standing uses a few more stabilizer muscles, a little more engagement in the calves and the back. But the difference is much, much smaller than you think. The fundamental issue, the lipoprotein lipase crash, the blood pooling, the metabolic slowdown, that happens whenever your muscles stop doing meaningful work. Sitting is one way to make that happen. Standing still is another. And here is where it gets really interesting. A research team at the University of Sydney published results from a study tracking more than 83,000 adults using objective measurements. They measured exactly how much time people spent sitting and how much they spent standing. And they asked a very clean question: does replacing sitting with standing reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease? The answer was no. Standing more did not reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. It did not reduce the risk of stroke. It did not reduce the risk of heart failure. Zero cardiovascular benefit from simply switching from sitting to standing. But they found something else. Something that should make every person with a standing desk pay attention. People who stood for long periods actually had a higher risk of circulatory problems, varicose veins, deep vein thrombosis, orthostatic conditions, where your blood pressure drops when you change position and you get dizzy. These are not small inconveniences. Deep vein thrombosis can kill you, and standing is making it more likely, not less. Why? Because when you stand still, gravity is pulling blood down into your legs. Your veins have one-way valves that are supposed to push it back up toward your heart, but those valves rely on your calf muscles squeezing the veins like a pump. If you are just standing there rigid, not walking, not shifting, those pumps are not working hard enough. Blood pools in your lower legs, the pressure builds, the vein walls stretch. Over time, they fail. It is a beautiful system when it works. Your calf muscle contracts, the vein gets squeezed, the blood moves upward through the one-way valve, the valve closes behind it so it cannot fall back down, and the cycle repeats with the next contraction. Engineers would recognize this as a positive displacement pump, one of the oldest and most reliable pumping mechanisms in existence. But like any pump, it only works when something is driving it. Standing still at a desk is like installing a pump and never turning it on. The plumbing is all there, the valves are ready, but nothing is moving because nothing is squeezing. A study in the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine found a significantly increased risk of varicose veins in people who stood or walked more than 6 hours a day. 6 hours, that is a normal workday at a standing desk. So you left your chair because sitting was killing you, and you stood up, and now standing is giving you a different set of problems. This is not what anyone expected. Let me say it clearly, the standing desk by itself is not saving your life. The data does not support it. If you bought one because you thought it would protect your heart, the evidence says you were misinformed. I am not blaming you. The message was everywhere. Sitting is the new smoking. That phrase, by the way, is one of the most irresponsible comparisons in modern health communication, and I want to spend a moment on why. Smoking increases your risk of dying from any cause by about 180%. Sitting, at its worst, increases it by about 22%. A heavy smoker, someone going through 40 or more cigarettes a day, has a fourfold increase in their death risk. The heaviest sitters, about 1.2 times the risk. In absolute numbers, smoking accounts for over 2,000 excess deaths per 100,000 people per year. Sitting accounts for about 190. These are not in the same universe. Saying sitting is the new smoking trivializes one of the deadliest habits in human history and simultaneously makes people terrified of something that is, while genuinely risky, manageable with surprisingly simple changes. Also, and this matters, sitting is not addictive. Sitting does not give you lung cancer. Sitting does not harm the person next to you. The comparison was always absurd. It was catchy. It was viral. But it was never accurate. So where does this leave us? If sitting is bad because of the stillness, and standing is not the solution because it is also a form of stillness, then what is the answer? The answer is embarrassingly simple, and that is probably why nobody wants to hear it. The answer is movement. Specifically, regular, low-intensity movement scattered throughout the day. Remember lipoprotein lipase, the enzyme that crashes when you sit still? Researchers found that slow walking, just gentle, easy walking, the kind you do when you wander to the kitchen for a glass of water, raises lipoprotein lipase activity by approximately 8-fold compared to being sedentary. Not heavy exercise, not running, not cycling at high intensity, just walking. The muscles contract, the enzyme wakes up, the fat starts getting cleared from your blood again, the metabolic machinery comes back online. This is important enough that I want to be very precise about it. Or the kind of movement we are talking about is so gentle it barely registers as exercise. You would not break a sweat. You would not raise your heart rate significantly. In the studies, it was classified as non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is the scientist's way of saying all the little movements you make during the day that are not deliberate exercise. Shuffling to the kitchen, standing up to stretch, walking to a colleague's office instead of picking up the telephone. These movements are metabolically significant, not because they burn many calories, but because they trigger muscular contractions that reactivate the enzyme system that sitting shuts down. Think of it this way. The metabolic cost of these movements is tiny. But the metabolic signal they send is enormous. The muscle does not need to work hard. It just needs to work at all. There is a threshold effect, a kind of on-off switch. Below a certain level of contraction, the system is dark. Above it, even just barely above it, the lights come back on. And the gap between totally still and just barely moving is where all the magic happens. And the evidence for this is consistent across multiple angles. A study found that replacing just 30 minutes of sitting per day with very light activity, even just standing and walking to the next room, led to measurable improvements in body mass index and cholesterol levels. Another large study found that people who alternated between sitting and not sitting at work had no increased mortality risk at all. Not sitting all day was fine. The people who mixed it up were fine. Only the people who sat overwhelmingly with no breaks showed the elevated risk. This brings me to what I think is the most important number in this entire discussion. It is not a percentage. It is a duration. How long you sit in a single unbroken stretch matters enormously, possibly more than how long you sit in total over the course of a day. Researchers studying older women found that those who sat for more than 30 minutes at a time in continuous bouts had a significantly higher risk than those who accumulated the same total sitting time but in shorter stretches. Think about what this means. Two people could sit for the same 10 hours in a day. One of them gets up every 20 or 30 minutes, walks around for 2 minutes, sits back down. The other sits for 3 or 4 hours straight, gets up for lunch, then sits for another 4 hours. The total sitting time is similar, but the health outcomes are dramatically different. It is not the chair, it is the continuity of the inactivity. It is the unbroken stretch of metabolic silence that causes the damage. Let me use an analogy that has nothing to do with clocks or trains. But think about a campfire. If you have logs burning, the fire stays hot. If the fire starts to die, you do not need to throw an entire tree on it. You just need to poke it, shift the logs, let a little air in. That tiny disturbance is enough to bring the flames back. But if you let the fire sit completely undisturbed for hours, the coals go cold, and now you have a much harder job restarting it. Your metabolism is that fire. Movement is the poking. You do not need to run a marathon in the middle of your workday. You need to poke the fire. Get up, walk 30 feet, sit back down. That is enough to keep lipoprotein lipase active, to keep blood flowing properly, to keep the system ticking. And once the fire goes cold, once you have sat still for 4 or 5 hours straight, restarting it takes real effort. A quick walk to the bathroom will not undo 4 hours of metabolic silence the way a 2-minute walk every 30 minutes would have prevented it from happening in the first place. Prevention is cheap, recovery is expensive. That is true in thermodynamics, and it is true in your bloodstream. There is one more wrinkle that makes this even more fascinating, and I want to make sure you hear it. The Whitehall 2 study, a famous long-term study out of the United Kingdom, followed over 81,000 person-years of data and found, to many people's surprise, no associated mortality risk from sitting time in their cohort. None at all. How is that possible? How can one study show sitting is deadly and another show it is not? The researchers proposed an explanation that I think cuts right to the heart of this whole puzzle. The people in the Whitehall study had higher than average daily activity, mostly from walking. They were walkers. They did not sit less than other populations, but they walked more. And that walking, that regular low-intensity activity, appeared to completely neutralize whatever damage the sitting was doing. What this tells you is that the sitting on its own might not be the primary driver of the health problems at all. It might be that sitting is just a marker for something else, insufficient total daily movement. You sit a lot, you probably also move very little. And it is the moving very little that is actually doing the damage. In a population where people sit plenty but also walk regularly, the sitting stops being dangerous. The poison is not the chair. The poison is the total absence of muscular work across the whole day. That is a very different message from sitting is the new smoking. It is a more accurate message, but it is less terrifying, less catchy, and it does not sell standing desks. So it did not spread. Now let me tie something together that I think most people miss entirely. We have been talking about what goes wrong when you are still, but there is also something interesting about what kind of stillness matters and what kind does not. Not all sitting is equal. Researchers have begun to point out that cognitively stimulating seated activities, studying a new language, playing chess, working through a complex problem on paper, might not carry the same risk profile as passive sitting, like watching television for hours. The hypothesis is that mental engagement might influence some of the physiological pathways, possibly through different hormonal or neurological responses to active attention versus passive reception. This research is early. We do not have definitive answers yet. But it raises a provocative question. Is a person sitting and deeply engaged in a mentally demanding task in the same metabolic state as a person slumped on a sofa staring at a screen? We do not know. But the honest answer is that it probably matters, and nobody has figured out exactly how much. Let me zoom out now and tell you what I think the real lesson is, because the real lesson is not about furniture. The human body was not designed by an engineer with a manual. It was shaped over millions of years by the pressures of survival in an environment where there were no chairs and no desks at all. Our ancestors walked, they squatted, they climbed, they reached, they carried, they rested on the ground, and then they got up again. The one thing they almost never did was hold a single position, any position, for hours without interruption. And here is the key insight from the evolutionary perspective. Our bodies did not evolve a special response to sitting. There is no sitting disease mechanism. What happened is that our bodies evolved to expect regular movement, and they built all of their maintenance systems, their fat processing, their blood sugar regulation, their vascular health, around the assumption that muscles would be doing some amount of work throughout the waking day. When you remove that expected input, the maintenance systems degrade. It is not that sitting attacks you, it is that sitting removes something your body was counting on. Like a house that does not rot because of some invading force. It rots because the ventilation stopped and the moisture had nowhere to go. The absence of movement is a withdrawal of maintenance, not an attack. The idea that there is some perfect posture, whether sitting or standing, that you can hold for 8 hours and remain healthy, that idea contradicts everything we know about how the body works. The body is built for variability. It wants to shift. It wants to alternate. It wants to cycle through different positions and different levels of effort throughout the day. When you deny it that variability, bad things happen. Not because sitting is evil or standing is evil, but because any sustained monotony of posture and effort is a violation of how the machine was meant to operate. So if you have a standing desk, great, use it, but sit for a while too, and walk for a while, and maybe squat for a while, and then sit again. The pattern matters more than the position. The interruptions matter more than the total hours. If you must remember one number from everything I have said today, remember this: 30 minutes. Do not sit for more than 30 minutes without getting up and moving, even briefly, even just for a minute or two. The evidence consistently points to this as a reasonable threshold where the metabolic damage starts to compound. If you can break every half hour with even a short walk, you are doing more for your heart, your blood sugar, and your fat metabolism than any standing desk on the market can accomplish. And if you must remember one idea, remember this: the body does not care what position you are in. It cares whether your muscles are doing something. The quieter your muscles are, and the longer they stay quiet, the more your internal chemistry starts to go wrong. It is not about sitting versus standing. It has never been about sitting versus standing. It is about stillness versus movement. And movement wins. Movement always wins. So the next time somebody tells you that sitting is the new smoking, you can tell them politely that smoking increases your mortality risk by 180%, and sitting increases it by about 22%, and that the real problem is not the chair, it is the fact that we forgot how to fidget. I want to leave you with one thought that I find genuinely unsettling, in the best possible way. The smallest, most trivial movements you make during the day, the ones you never think about, getting up to refill your water, walking to talk to someone instead of calling them, pacing while you think through a problem, those throwaway moments of activity are not throwaway at all. They are the main event. They are the thing keeping your lipoprotein lipase active, your triglycerides in check, your blood vessels healthy. The big workout at the gym is wonderful for many reasons, but it cannot undo 8 hours of perfect stillness. The casual movements can. The biggest health intervention most people could make is not buying a piece of equipment or following a program. It is getting up from wherever they are right now and walking to the other side of the room. That is it. That is the whole secret. And if that seems too simple, too unimpressive to be the answer, well, that is usually how nature works. The answer is simple. It is getting people to actually do it. That is the hard part. We spent billions of dollars on standing desks. Entire industries grew up around the idea that the chair was the enemy, and all along the answer was in the most primitive, most overlooked human activity there is. Just getting up, just walking a few steps, just reminding your muscles briefly that they exist and that they have a job to do. Everything else, the fancy desks, the ergonomic chairs, the treadmill workstations, all of it is just furniture. The biology does not care about your furniture, it cares about your muscles. Give them something to do, even something tiny, even something that takes 30 seconds, and they will take care of the rest. Tell me this: what is the longest stretch you go without getting up during a typical day? I am curious what you would say.